Hey everybody, and welcome back to another fun and exciting intermediate math class. In today's lesson, we'll be finishing up chapter number 11. So, yeah, that's right. We only have one chapter left after this. So keep up the good work. Chapter 11.7 is found on page 479. Page 479. Here's what we'll be talking about in this lesson, pure quadratic. You might be thinking, I've never even heard of that word before, quadratic. What in the world is a quadratic? Well, good news. You're in luck. I know what it means, and I'm going to teach you what it means. So let's go ahead and take a look down here and see if we can figure this out together. All right, so a quadratic is any equation that has a squared term. What's a squared term? That's like x squared. And as long as that's the highest ordered variable, so in other words, it's not like x cubed plus x squared, this would not be a quadratic because the highest term has to be the x squared. So we could have x squared plus x plus 3 equals 6. That would be a quadratic because the highest ordered term is the squared term. So anything with a squared term, not necessarily, but anything that has the highest order is the squared term would be considered a quadratic. All right, so now what does this mean when it says pure quadratic? The pure quadratic occurs when both sides of the equation are perfect squares. So something like x squared equals 64, for example. X squared is a square. What does that mean? Well, that means x times x, right? That's a perfect square. And then 64 is also a perfect square because we have 8 times 8. Both of them are perfect squares. So this would qualify as a pure quadratic. All right, so let's go ahead and look at these and let's see if we can figure out how to solve these. Here's another perfect quadratic, and I'll be working through this one just a little bit as we go through these steps. So x squared equals 4. Both of them are perfect squares, x times x and 2 times 2. So here's the steps to solving the pure quadratic. Number 1, simplify each side of the equation. Do what you can do. So let's come back here. It's already solved. There's nothing that we can do. What if it said x plus 10, okay, for example? Then we would do that. We would say, okay, x plus 10 is 14. If it was 10 and if it was x equals 14, that would not necessarily be a pure quadratic. There would be a little bit more that we would have to do to that one, and we wouldn't get it to come out evenly. But I think you get the idea. If there's something that you can do, then go ahead and do it. Simplify each side of the equation. Number 2, we want to isolate the square by moving everything else to the other side. Good news, this square is already isolated. What if we had something like x squared plus 3 equals 7? Well, I would need to subtract 3 from both sides and get x squared equals 4. Okay, so get the x squared term by itself, or whatever your squared term. It might be an a squared, b squared. Get the squared term by itself. That's step number 2. Step number 3, we want to take the square root of both sides of the equation. Now we can do that here because we're ready, because we didn't have anything that we could do. We didn't need to get the x squared by itself. It was already by itself. So we need to take the square root of both sides of the equation. I'm going to square root the x squared side, and I'm going to square root the other side. Next, we will do number 4. Always use a plus minus symbol to show that both the positive and the negative numbers are valid solutions. Okay, well, check this out. What do we get when we square root x squared? Well, we get x equals, what is the square root of 4? The square root of 4 is positive negative 2. Let's think through that. So if we have positive 2 times 2, we're going to get 4. And if we have negative 2 times negative 2, we're going to get positive 4. They both give us positive 4. So we would have to say that positive 2 is part of the answer and negative 2 is part of the answer because they both work. In other words, If we sub in 2 right here, we would get 2 squared equals 4, and that checks. And if we were to sub in -2, we would get -2 squared equals 4, positive 4. Negative times negative equals positive. That also checks. Both of those answers are possible solutions. This is the first time that you're seeing that an equation can have more than one answer. There might be 2 answers that solve the equation. Both of them work. So now let's look down at the next step. Check your solution by plugging in. We just did that as part of kind of going through that last step. And then the last thing, take a look at this. Quadratics always give you 2 solutions because there's 2 x's. You might be thinking, what do you mean there's 2 x's? Look at this. What is x squared? X squared equals x times x. So each one of those x's can have a different answer. Okay. Now, in this case, they're both going to have the same, but it's going to be positive and negative. So it's going to be positive 2, negative 2. But the answer is 2, but you have both the positive version of that and the negative version of that. And 2 positive and 2 negative are both very different. If you don't believe that, then give me $2. So now you're going to be negative $2, right? So there's a big difference between positive $2 and being negative $2. You want to be positive, right? You want money in your hand. You don't want to be negative $2. All right, let's do some more of these. These are so much fun. You're having a good time, I know. So let's follow our steps. We're going to do what we can do. There's nothing to be done. There's nothing that we can add or subtract or anything. So now we're going to isolate the x squared term. Good news again, it's already isolated. The next thing that we want to do is we want to go ahead and take the square root of both sides. The square root of x squared is x. In other words, that just cancels out right there, and we get x equals, the square root of 144 is plus minus 12. Be very careful to use the plus minus. That's our solution. We could circle that. Now what we can do is plug that back in. So we would say 12 squared equals 144. Negative 12 squared equals 144 as well. That is also true. So both of these work. We've checked our solution. Don't forget to make sure that you always include that sign with these pure quadratics. All right, let's do the next one. Now here we go. We finally got one, right? Do what you can do. Well, technically there's nothing that we can do to this one because I can't do anything here because I can't combine anything there. There's nothing to be done over on this side. So step number 2 says we want to isolate this x squared. We want to get it by itself. So we're going to subtract 1 from each side. That's going to cancel that. We're going to get 2x squared equals 8. Now, we still don't have it by itself. We need to divide each side by 2 so that we get x squared equals, and that would be 4. Now we've got it by itself. Now we can go on to the next step, which is square root both sides. And then we would get x equals plus minus 2. And that would be your answer. Now you plug that back in. Now this is where I'm going to show you where checking these. Before you might have been like, oh, why do I even need to check these? Well, now checking them is very important because now we come over here and we have this whole thing right here, and it just looks like you can't just check it easily in your mind. You actually have to plug back in. So what if we put a positive 2 right here? 2 times 2 squared plus 1 equals 9. So let's just do that. 2 squared, order of operation is very important here. 2 squared is 4, so then 2 times 4 plus 1 equals 9. 2 times 4 is 8, 8 plus 1 is 9 equals 9. We got it correct. That worked. Now what we want to see is, does it also work if we use the negative 2? And that is important to check both of your answers. Now you might say, come on, of course it's going to be true. Well, trust me, the farther we go in algebra, it's not always true. There's such a thing as called an extraneous root. Big word, I know. But extraneous roots don't solve. So sometimes when we plug this back in, it's not going to solve out correctly. So go ahead and make sure that you sub it back in. Just get used to doing both of them because that's going to be important here in a little bit. So negative 2 squared plus 1 equals 9. And so now we get back to this, plus 1 equals 9, and we do get 9 equals 9. And so that does check. So both of those check, so your answer is positive negative 2. Let me show you one other place that you're going to use this, and that is in triangles. So you have Pythagorean's theorem, which hopefully you remember is c squared equals a squared plus b squared. And maybe you wrote that a squared plus b squared equals c squared. That's fine. It's the same thing. I just kind of switched it around to make it easier as we do this. All right, so here we go. We're going to be looking for something that is our hypotenuse. That's what we need to find. So if we go through this, we're going to, so this x is technically our c, right? Because that's our hypotenuse. Because this is our c side. This would be our small letter c. That's our hypotenuse. So our 3 could go in here, and our 4 could go in here, and we end up with c squared, or you could call that x squared. Doesn't matter, either one. X squared equals a squared, which is 3 squared, plus b squared, which is 4 squared. And now we have x squared equals, and this is 9, and this is 16. And so you end up with x squared equals 25. Now this is where you would take the square root of both sides, okay? And then you end up with x equals plus minus 5. Now, here's a little bit of a trick in geometry. You cannot have, I can't say that x equals negative 5. That doesn't work. Why not? Because you can't have a negative length side. So we would say that x equals 5 only, because the negative doesn't really work, because in reality you can't have a negative 5-inch side to a triangle. So sometimes you only include the positive, but when we're in algebra, this is geometry right here, right? But when you're in algebra, you would give both the positive and the negative answer for those. All right, well, that's all I have for you in this lesson. Hopefully you learned something there. Make sure that you do these practice problems, work through these. These are not that challenging, so hopefully you can follow those steps. If you ever get something, at least in these pure quadratics, that you can't find the square root of, that means you probably did something wrong. Go back and look at when you move things to one side. When you did what you can do, make sure that you did that correctly. And just keep working there, and you should get, every time that you get this, you should get square numbers, like 8 times 8 is 64, 10 times 10 is 100. You should get those types of numbers so that when you take the square root of both sides, it will give you a whole number as your answer. In algebra class, it won't give you a whole number as your answer all the time. Sometimes it will give you, roots that you can't solve out. And we'll deal with that when we get there. So that's all I've got for you in this lesson. If you missed anything, make sure to scroll it back, watch it again. We'll see you later. You have a good one. Bye-bye.